A remarkable event in the Oval Office between President Donald Trump and the president of South Africa, invited to the White House, interestingly, amid allegations by President Trump and Elon Musk, who is also in the Oval Office right now, allegations of genocide, a word that was used openly and repeatedly in the Oval Office against white farmers, Afrikaners, some of whom have been given refugee status here in the United States. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. A pleasure to welcome our global television audience to the conversation. Kailey, the optics of what we just witnessed here, and we're going to hear the word ambush, I suspect, against the South African leader who clearly was watching tape on Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office and came prepared to try to compliment and dazzle President Trump. We will go back to the Oval Office if this goes back to a conversation about genocide or actual policy here. But the president actually played a video to everyone in the Oval Office, including President Ramaphosa. Unclear exactly what that video was purporting to show. I guess genocide against white farmers, if you ask President Trump, but apparently was the leader of another political party, and we cannot obviously back up any of the claims that the president is making today. Well,
we also should point out that when asked by President Ramaphosa where in the video exactly in South Africa this footage was coming from, President Trump just said simply it was in South Africa without getting into specifics. We also should note these claims of genocide that have been propagated by both President Trump and Elon Musk are unsubstantiated, though they do, of course, have made a lot of noise about what they say is the persecution of white Afrikaner farmers in South Africa. To your point about Ramaphosa perhaps conducting himself differently than we saw with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he, of course, has not yet raised his voice with President Trump necessarily, though he did say at one point that it should be evidence to President Trump that this is not actually the situation in South Africa, that his agricultural minister is there in the Oval Office, part of this delegation with him, who happens himself to be a white Afrikaner.
Yeah, that's correct. The ag minister said the majority of South African farmers, in fact, want to stay, taking issue with some of the reports. President Trump actually had hard copy of newspaper front pages, presumably, or online stories that he had printed out a stack of them and handed them over to the South African president, repeating death, death, he said, going through each of them, horrible death. This is clearly a meeting that's not done. And as we mentioned, we'll return to that if we have the opportunity, if we hear from the president again.
And we want to get more on this now with Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Mike, obviously, in addition to the claims of genocide, there were other substantive topics that we expected to be on the agenda today for this meeting between Ramaphosa and President Trump, including perhaps South Africa's stance toward Israel, also trade, knowing a 30% reciprocal tariff was slated to go into effect against South African goods, which, of course, is now subject to the 90-day pause, but that's expiring in July.
You're right, Kailey. We would have expected more of this conversation to actually focus and be dominated by those key issues of commerce between the U.S. and South Africa. And at the start, we even heard Cyril Ramaphosa talk about this. He talked about critical minerals, obviously an area of key interest to the president. And, of course, South Africa is eager, like so many other nations and trading partners, to escape the U.S. tariffs, or at least feel the minimum pain possible from U.S. import levies through negotiations with the administration. But the negotiations that were carried out just now in the Oval Office were about something else entirely, and it was very much a one-way conversation. At one point, the South African president respectfully said maybe we should usher the press out to discuss this issue more fully in private so you could hear our view without the press present. And the president just kept going and pressed his point on the unsubstantiated claims of genocide against those Afrikaner farmers.
He's been listening and watching along with us. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. Thank you so much, Mike, for the real-time analysis. One thing we have not been talking about as a result of this Oval Office visit and the meeting with the South African president is what's happening on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And in fact, President Trump, we learn, will be meeting with members of the House Freedom Caucus about the tax cut and spending cut bill, the reconciliation process that's underway right now in a Rules Committee hearing. Kailey, we're now, I believe, 12 hours into that process, and a lot of questions about whether we will see a floor vote on what the president calls one big, beautiful bill. Much of this hinges on a deal around raising the SALT cap, and that's why we're really glad to be joined by Congressman Mike Lawler. The Republican from New York is with us now live from Capitol Hill. And Congressman, we really appreciate you being so generous with your time and waiting for the president to wrap at least this part of the conversation in the Oval Office. There is news of a deal on SALT, a $40,000 cap. If that's real, Congressman, you managed to quadruple the current cap. Is that the kind of bacon that you can bring home?
Look, this was a critically important negotiation. I was very clear for over 2 years that I would never support a tax bill that did not adequately lift the cap on SALT. We put pen to paper yesterday, met with leadership, worked throughout the course of the day to come to an agreement that would lift the cap on SALT and provide real and immediate and lasting tax relief for hardworking middle-class families. The agreement would lift the cap to $40,000 with an income cap of $500,000 that would be phased out, and anyone making above that would go back down to $10,000, which is the current cap, and it provides for the entirety of the 10 years of the bill, which is critically important to make sure that folks are getting real relief. You look at a district like mine, 3 of the top 4 of the 4 counties I represent are in the top 16 highest property tax counties in America. So when we talk about these issues, this isn't about the rich. This is about providing tax relief to middle-class families who are besieged by high property taxes and high income taxes. And many of my colleagues will say that a lot of people don't itemize and they don't take the SALT deduction. Well, that's true because we doubled the standard deduction, and part of the pay for doubling that was SALT. And so we're seeking, after 7 years of having this $10,000 cap, to provide real relief to the middle class, and that's what this is about.
So, Congressman, should we take that to assume, with the terms of this deal, that you are now a yes on this legislation? And assuming you are you aware of any member of the SALT caucus who is not yet to yes with you?
I think the members of the SALT caucus, negotiated yesterday in good faith with leadership, with the administration, and we settled on something that we believe in, that we support. Obviously, we're waiting for the final details to emerge out of the Rules Committee, but obviously we made great progress yesterday, and I feel much better about where the bill is as a result.
There does seem to be some growing optimism over a possible floor vote as soon as today, Congressman, maybe tomorrow. I know the Speaker wanted to see it happen by the Memorial Day break. Will that be the case?
I know the administration and leadership are working to get that done, meeting with members today. Obviously, that time frame is something the Speaker set out to achieve. The objective here is to get the bill passed, ultimately to take effect, to make sure that we are providing real tax relief, that we are securing our border, that we are strengthening our military, increasing domestic production of energy, and protecting vital programs like Medicaid long-term, and cutting out the waste, fraud, and abuse, and making sure that illegal immigrants, for instance, are not receiving benefits, and taking away from the very people who rely on these programs, like the IDD community or our seniors or children. We want to protect this for the long term, get our fiscal house in order while providing real tax relief. That's what this bill is about. We've been working on it for months. Obviously, anytime you're negotiating, there's going to be a give and take. There's going to be a back and forth. You work through these issues and come to an agreement. And, as I've said many times, anybody who's ever been married knows you're going to have to find compromises along the way. You're not going to get everything you want in life. So you've got to work through this, and that's what we've done in good faith.
Well, and it's not just compromises within the House Republican conference, but there also may need to be compromises made between the House and Senate, which will take up this measure next, assuming it can get off the House floor. Congressman, has the Speaker shared with you any assurances that the Senate will not make changes to the SALT deal that he just negotiated with you and your colleagues?
This obviously has been a big topic of conversation, and I'll keep those conversations private, but I certainly know that the Speaker understands how important it is that this agreement remain intact.
I want to go back to the case that you made for raising the salt cap in the outset, Congressman. We heard from Chip Roy, of course, a loud member of the Freedom Caucus, who I understand is going to be meeting with the president later on today. He suggested that leadership is buying, quote, a handful of seats with $350 billion in parochial tax subsidies in the form of salt. Is it possible to have a conversation with someone who holds that point of view, or are you counting him out?
Listen, I respect all my colleagues and their perspectives. The fact is, New York is a donor state. We send more money down to Washington than we get back. So we can get into the subsidy debate about which states are taking money from the federal government and which ones are actually helping fund the federal government. But the fact is that New Yorkers should not be double taxed. They should not be penalized for living in a high tax state. Salt was in effect for over 100 years, and it was used as a pay-for. And frankly, part of that pay-for was to double the standard deduction and provide tax relief to Americans all across this country. We're just simply saying, after 7 years of the $10,000 cap, which was arbitrary and capricious, that we need to have a much fairer approach. And that's what we have negotiated. Everybody has understood this for well over 2 years. I ran on this. I fought for it. I said it very clearly from the moment I came here that I would never support a bill that doesn't adequately lift the cap on salt. We have been working to negotiate to an agreement. And so that's what we've done, and I stand by it.
Well, and of course, you and your fellow New Yorkers who have helped make the Republican majority have made the case that if that majority is to be retained, there needs to be changes to SALT. But as we look ahead to 2026, if the other side of this, getting what you want on SALT, is conservatives also getting a pulling forward of stricter work requirements around Medicaid to begin in December of 2026, as we understand, does that not put the majority at risk for a whole other reason? How do you navigate around that issue in the midterms?
Well, look, at the end of the day, I think there's broad consensus within the conference on a few key areas. Number one, eligibility verification, making sure that somebody who is not eligible doesn't remain on the program for up to a year, which is what the Biden administration allowed. Citizenship verification, making sure that illegal immigrants are not receiving benefits that they're not entitled to. And work requirements. Able-bodied adults without dependents should be trying to work. I mean, you're talking about 80 hours a month of work requirements or educational requirements or volunteering. Anybody who is able-bodied should be trying to improve their life by working. The fact is, Medicaid is a means-tested program. And so as part of that, you are trying to help lift people up, lift them out of poverty, lift them out of their situation. Work requirements are something Democrats fought for years. Bill Clinton was the biggest champion of work requirements. So I don't think the issue of work requirements speeding up from 29 to 27 is frankly an impediment. I think there's broad consensus that we should be trying to help people lift themselves up. Work requirements is a way to help facilitate that as we are providing them with support through Medicaid.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate you joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York with us live from Capitol Hill, focusing, of course, on the issues that have dominated the conversation in the halls of Congress, the SALT cap and Medicaid. And that doesn't just go for the Republican side of the aisle, but Democrats as well. We spoke actually yesterday with a Democrat, the ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Frank Pallone, on the late edition of Balance of Power about some of these issues. And this was the take that he gave opposite the congressman's we just heard.
Raising the SALT limit or getting rid of the cap altogether would certainly be a good thing, but it doesn't outweigh all the other problems with the Medicaid cuts and people losing their health care. So, again, the focus on SALT, I think, is misplaced because the real problem here is that most of this money is going to, for tax cuts for large corporations and billionaires, and all these cuts to Medicaid and health care are being used to pay for it.
We know that as ranking member on the committee, you helped to lead the charge on what I believe was a 26-hour-long markup of this legislation a couple of nights ago. Congressman, the Congressional Budget Office says more than 8 million people will lose their health care as a result of the bill that passed through Energy and Commerce, your committee, last week. I don't know how many people in Metuchen, New Jersey that impacts.
But is your fight here done, or is there another lever that you can pull?
No, the fight is not done. First of all, these numbers keep going up because the bill does not address the ACA subsidies and renew the Affordable Care Act subsidies on the exchange and marketplace. CBO actually estimates now that 13.7 million people will lose their health care between their health insurance, between Medicaid cuts and the ACA not being renewed. And that number keeps going up. I mean, the Congressional Budget Office just put out a new report today saying that, basically saying that there would be $700 billion in Medicaid cuts and another $100 billion in ACA cuts. And you have to remember, Joe, that the Republicans said they weren't going to cut Medicaid. And it's simply not true. I mean, that's exactly what they're doing to pay for these tax cuts.
Democratic Congressman Frank Pallone talking with us on the late edition of Balance of Power to bring you the view from the other side of the aisle here. Remembering this is, of course, an entirely Republican exercise because it is reconciliation we're talking about. I want to add the voice of another Republican. Congressman Kevin Hern of Oklahoma joins us now live from Capitol Hill amid the swirling debate over tax cuts, spending cuts. And as we just heard, Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, Congressman Pallone talking about Medicaid cuts. And I know that there's been some evolving rhetoric around this. A lot of Republicans see this not as a cut, but as making the program more efficient and, in fact, work better. There was a time when you were known as the Mick Congressman. You owned, I believe, nearly 20 McDonald's franchises in the Tulsa area. How do you make that argument to an entry-level worker at McDonald's?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And it is, obviously both sides are talking about what's in the bill. I would argue that the Democrats are trying to do everything they can to make America afraid. But here's the reality. Reality is the waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicaid, as the president has talked, and I support everything he's talking about. He has said explicitly, do not cut the benefits to the American workers, the people who need Medicaid out there. He said it again yesterday. He said it in the press. He has not mixed words about this, and so he wants us to go after the people that are legally on Medicaid. He wants us to look at work requirements for those who are able to work, that don't have dependents, and that's going to make the Medicaid program more solvent. But we also know that the Medicaid program is probably the one area of government benefits that is going to explode and is exploding right now in exposure and cost that's going to be required to keep it afloat into the future.
Well, so if that is the case, Congressman, are we talking about long-term solves here with these measures, or does something more substantial need to be done? Do the members of the Freedom Caucus actually have a valid point that they're making?
Well, the only way that there's going to be anything that's going to make all of our programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, solvent for all of those into the future is to come together in a bipartisan way. This will never be done in a reconciliation process where one party has control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, whether it's the Democrats or Republicans. There just will not be enough willpower to make that happen, because everybody knows to do it unilaterally, the other side, as you're seeing with the Democrats, will demagogue it so badly that nothing will get done. And that's why you're seeing that if we don't do anything with Social Security and Medicare, sit down together in a responsible way, Democrats, Republicans, then in less than 7 years, there's going to be a 21% across the board cut. And so we have to come together to work on these programs to make sure that they're solvent for those who deserve them.
I know this is still tied up in the Rules Committee as we speak, Congressman, and there's no sign of this hearing coming to an end while we're talking today, but there's an expectation that we'll see a floor vote as soon as tonight, maybe tomorrow. Do you hear that that's the case? Is that what you're planning for, or could this be an extended working weekend, maybe into the holiday for your caucus?
Yeah. So as part of leadership, I can tell you right now, it has been our mission to get this done before Memorial Day weekend, which, tonight's the night we're going to make this happen. Right now, as you mentioned, the amendments are being debated in the Rules Committee that started meeting at 1 a.m. this morning. And I think what this has proved, whether it's last week's markups, we're going to work day and night to make sure that America's taxes remain low. President Trump's fingerprints are all over this, starting with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, making that permanent. The tax cuts he's doing for the working class, upwards of $2,000 in additional taxes that will not be taken from our people making, working on tips or working in overtime. So all of these things are important, and including reducing the tax burden on our seniors by some $500 to $700 per year. All of these things the president has done. This is not about giving tax cuts to the rich, as the Democrats are wanting to use a talking point from 7 years ago. This is about making permanent. You all report on business outcomes. There's not a business person in America that says by me keeping my taxes where they are, that somehow that's going to cost the federal government. Only in the scoring of the Congressional Budget Office does that actually cost money.
Well, Congressman, you are right. We do focus on business outcomes here. And we also know that there are businesses that were counting on tax credits and other subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act that may be rolled back now. You actually told our colleagues on Capitol Hill earlier today that it's your understanding the Freedom Caucus is going to try to talk to the White House about clawing back tax credits from existing projects. Can they do that? And is that something not only do you expect the House conference is willing to support, but would the Senate get behind an initiative like that?
Well, I don't know about the Senate, but that's my understanding. That's been reported that they're wanting to look at projects that have already been connected to the grid that are not yet complete, or are still being in work in process, and then having those costs borne by the ratepayers. That's if somebody has to pay them, and the way our utility system is set up, the commissions or the oversight groups of each state would be, those public utilities would be able to go back to the ratepayers to be able to make up for that, instead of the federal government paying, somebody in Oklahoma paying for a grid system in, say, Kentucky or somewhere. And so I don't know what the final details of that are going to be. They wanted to go to the White House to talk about this, so my assumption is that they're on their way over there to get support from the president on this. Again, this is really important part. It's a very, should that happen, it would be, I think it's $300 to $400 billion in possible scoring that would be additional savings. In Ways and Means, because we did all of our stuff working together, not, trying to work through these and hash out. We had a lot of dialogue. We have, folks from, very rich coal country. We have folks from oil and gas states like myself. We have people that have been in business for a long time like myself, and we've had others that have been in state politics that understand how these green credits work and how they, how they're important to states generating jobs and, encumbered by debt and equity situations. So all of this was fleshed out. That's why we came to $515 billion in saving on the green credits by shortening the phase-out time, but still allowing for people that had projects going to be able to utilize those.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate you joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Republican Congressman Kevin Hern of Oklahoma here with us on Balance of Power as we continue to follow the movement on Capitol Hill toward trying to get to a vote on budget reconciliation. We're also following the markets. I would note we did see at the top of this hour a 20-year auction that tailed weak demand, and that has sent Treasury yields materially higher. We're now up 11 basis points on the 30-year to 5.08%, and you're seeing a subsequent move in equities as well. The S&P 500 has rolled over in a big way, now down about 1.3%. We'll get more on that with our colleague Charlie Pellet in New York in just a moment. But first, we want to check in with our political panel who is joining us today. Kristen Hawn is with us, partner at ROKK Solutions and Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Lisa Camooso-Miller, former RNC communications director. Welcome to you both. As we consider what is happening in the markets right now, especially in the bond market, may be tied to what's actually happening with fiscal policy. So it's great to get your perspective on the direction that this is really heading. Lisa, do you expect that this package, with the changes the speaker is negotiating, either has finalized with the SALT caucus, perhaps still working on the conservatives, can have a vote this week?
Kailey, it really feels unlikely. It feels like everything that I'm seeing, every indication that I'm hearing, there's a movement from leadership that really wants to get this done by the week's end. The president is obviously asking for the same. But the Freedom Caucus has said that they do not feel like a vote this week it makes good sense. They feel like it's an arbitrary deadline. And so it feels to me like there are just far too many factions still undecided that would get us through and get this done. This is Wednesday. We still have a rules package. We don't necessarily have that through the Rules Committee. And then that goes to the floor, and then more debate happens. So while the movement continues to go and advance itself, it doesn't necessarily, to me, at least right now, feel like it's likely to happen before the end of the week.
You've seen a couple of these, Kristen Hawn. What's your take? Because we spoke with a very optimistic Mike Lawler at the top of the hour. Chip Roy sounds exactly the opposite. Unclear if the president can change moods today. Is this bill gaining momentum, or is it slowing down?
Well, I mean, I think Mike Lawler has a reason to be happy right now. So he's coming out of a very positive meeting. Meanwhile, a lot of his colleagues are not. So, I agree with Lisa. I think that, this is, the legislative process. Although I really do think that the president and the House Republican leadership, I mean, if I were in one of those tough seats to hold on to as a Republican, I would be very wary of taking a vote on a bill like this because it's going to come back to haunt them.
Well, and when we consider what will come back to haunt whom, and the positioning of President Trump specifically here, Lisa, who obviously would like to see a Republican majority maintained to the extent, and he wants to see this package, perhaps first and foremost, passed by Congress. He went to Capitol Hill yesterday to make the case. We understand he'll be meeting at the White House this afternoon with the Speaker and holdouts in the House Freedom Caucus. Is he able to convince them today of what he couldn't yesterday, or is he losing his power to exercise complete control over the Republican conference?
I think, Kailey, I've said this before, and I continue to assert that this is a system where, in order to get what you want from the White House, in order for the White House to get the Congress to move, they have to have an agreement amongst the parties about how the parties of those, the Congress and that White House, agreement on policy issues. The president has the tariffs that are still overweighing and leaning over a lot of these districts where they're already feeling the pinch and already feeling the pain. And I think the difference between what the president is asking for and what the Freedom Caucus is looking for is still very, very far apart. So as much as the president's going to tell them to do whatever they can, they also know that when it comes down to midterm elections, the president is not going to have as much of a sway as he once did, because he is, in fact, in the second half at that point of his term, and it will make him less and less powerful. So over time, the president will have less control and less opportunity to really influence those members, because they, in fact, are really trying to defend their seats and stay in power. And also, they need to go home in just a few short weeks to defend their decision and defend this vote. And that, to me, would be the one thing that stands in between the president being successful and those members in those tough districts taking a vote that they won't necessarily be able to defend when they return in the summertime to their districts.
Kristen, if Democrats don't have a seat at the table, and they don't by the nature of reconciliation, this is a Republican-only exercise, are they scheduling town halls for this Memorial Day break to try to shine a light on what's happening here? We know that Republicans have been wary of doing so based on the DOJ, based on Medicaid. What are Democrats going to do when they go home?
I think it's interesting that you asked, because yes, I mean, the short answer is yes. And I know I was in touch with some friends over in the House yesterday about the extent of those plans. And it's not just going home to their own districts to talk to their constituents about what is happening and what this bill actually does, specifically with regard to Medicaid cuts. But they will be pointing those things out in these Republican districts as well. So the identified areas where this would particularly hurt some of these Republican districts, making sure that their constituents know, what at least this House bill is doing. And as we all know, this bill, if and when it does pass the House, is going to go over to the Senate, and there are going to be, a multitude of changes to this bill. So I think, when these members go home, they're going to have a number of things to answer for, particularly as these cuts begin to take place if the Republicans are ultimately successful.
Well, and they may have to answer a lot of questions about the impact this is ultimately going to have on the deficit and the long-term burden that the United States and the people within it are saddled with. Lisa, that seems to be what we're seeing evidence of in financial markets today, in the bond market especially, as we're seeing yields rocketing higher on both the 10-year and the 30-year. We're up more than 10 basis points. And we have seen President Trump in the past, granted it was related to tariffs earlier this year, take a look at what's happening in the bond market, identify what he saw as queasiness, and decide to change his course of action. If we are seeing material upset in financial markets once again over this legislative package that he campaigned on, that we know he wants very badly, would you expect any kind of similar change of heart, or is this already largely done and dusted?
It's really hard to tell, Kailey. It does feel like while he is saying, damn the torpedoes and let's go forward, the president also is mindful of the fact that if the market takes a hit or if there are shifts in underpinnings of the market, that he very well will adjust, because he doesn't necessarily want to have to answer for that, because he knows that those kinds of signs are signs of long-term pain and not short-term pain. And that's the other thing that I think he will be watching for and his advisors will be watching for. But ultimately, Kailey, he wants a win so badly. He wants this big, beautiful bill, one big piece of legislation, which, good golly, I'm as old to know. I mean, the last time we did that was in 2010 when we passed the Affordable Care Act. So it's been a long time since we've had a great, big, giant bill get passed in the Congress in the way that the White House wants to see it done. But, if anybody's willing to take the shot and take this unprecedented stance and way to move, it'll be Donald Trump.
Kristen, it's interesting as we consider what we're seeing in the bond market here, the concerns on Wall Street across the board about rising debt and deficits. This is something that the party in power frequently loses religion on. But it's going to be hard for lawmakers to hide from what's happening in the markets when it's right before our eyes like this. Was extending the current policy baseline the original sin in this process? How come we're not arguing about how to pay for it?
I mean, I think I do think so. And I think that you're exactly right. The reason why we're not arguing about how to pay for it is because you've got one party control in Washington. They want to extend these tax cuts, and it's very, very difficult to do that if you're looking at actually paying for it. So it's easier to saddle future generations with that debt. And I know it's people, who are in the minority party generally get religion on this and talk about saddling future generations, but it really is, and it has real impacts on our national security. And, you look at the CBO scoring, and you're going to hear a lot from Republicans as they come out in support of this bill, talking about dynamic scoring and all of these things. I mean, it's a tale as old as time. At the end of the day, I do agree with the congressman that both sides are going to have to get together and figure this thing out. But as long as there's one party control in Washington, it's not going to happen.
The CBO says this plan would increase the deficit by $2.3 trillion over a decade, something that the market is looking at very closely here. The 30-year now soaring above 5%. After this 20-year auction, it's something that Charlie Pellet has his eyes on, and we want to update the markets with thanks to our panel, Lisa Camooso Miller and Kristen Hawn. A great conversation. Charlie Pellet is live at World Headquarters in New York. This is falling apart pretty quickly here, Charlie. What are you looking at?
Absolutely right about that, Joe Mathieu. Indeed, since our last update, a dramatic turn lower and a dramatic shift in sentiment with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red. Treasury yields jumping after a weak $16 billion sale. We are seeing concern about a ballooning deficit, also America's status as a safe haven. Right now, we have got the S&P down 60 at 58.79. That is a drop now of just about 1%. The Dow lower by 1.5%. A lot of red, down 659 right now. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 157, down 0.8%. The NASDAQ 100 Index down 0.7%, but cannot ignore the move lower in the Russell 2000 Index. Small cap shares tumbling now 2.2%. The Bloomberg Mag 7 Index down by 0.4%. Your 10-year, 4.57%. The 2-year, 4.01%. Joe mentioned the 30-year, 5.06%. Spot gold up $20 the ounce, up 0.6%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 5.10, 61.70 a barrel on WTI. And we absolutely cannot ignore the surge in Bitcoin today, up by 0.4% right now, but a $107,000 handle on Bitcoin, 107,460. Indeed, we are looking at a record today for Bitcoin. So recapping here, Treasury yields are jumping. The 10-year 4.57%. Stocks are selling off. S&P down 52, a drop there of 0.9%. Balance of power continues right now. Back we go to Washington. More on the markets coming up. Once again, let's go back to Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Real-time updates on the markets every day here on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg Radio. on Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg Originals as we spin a couple of plates here, frequently the case on this program, straddling both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, with not only the debate that we've been talking about over reconciliation on Capitol Hill, but Kailey, an important visit to the White House today. We're going to be talking with Patrick Gaspard about a bit later on. The president of South Africa is in town. We've got to spend a little more time on these markets, though, because we've seen a wild turn since we came to air today.
Well, yeah, and it's hard to extract the stories we're tracking here in Washington from the stories that Wall Street is tracking. I mean, even in the case of what we saw go down between the South African president and President Trump, you're seeing the rand moving off the back of that. And certainly, as we track what's happening on Capitol Hill, bond markets are taking note of the potential fiscal situation we could find ourselves in if this one big, beautiful bill passes. And that was evidenced by weak demand in a 20-year auction. That tail sending yields higher, as Charlie was just running us through. We're now well north of 5% on the 30-year to 5.06%. And on that note, we turn to Mike Regan joining us from New York. He's Bloomberg senior editor, helping us keep track of these markets. Mike, we've seen before the bond market getting quote unquote queasy, if you will, to use the words of President Trump. At that time, it was over concern about reciprocal tariffs. This time, is this really all about what's going on in Congress?
I think it's a big part of it, Kelly. Obviously, you know, we also have basically the first big auction since the Moody's downgrade of U.S. sovereign debt on Friday, really eliminating that last AAA rating on U.S. bonds. And so hard to say if it's directly related to that, but certainly all the concerns that Moody's brought up, the fact that the deficits appear like they will get even bigger and bigger, especially if the 2017 tax cuts are extended, and that not only are the deficits getting bigger, but the interest rates to fund these deficits in the bond market are higher than they have been in many years. And that obviously just makes government borrowing much more expensive. And to your point, it was exactly that, what's known as a tail on Wall Street in the bond auction. In other words, this 20-year sale, $16 billion in 20-year debt, was auctioned at a higher interest rate than what was suggested in when issued trading before the auction. At the yield came in at 5.047%. So really only 1 basis point above when issued, but not a good sign as far as demand goes when you see an auction tail like that, especially at these elevated rates. There was some hope that this rate above 5% might draw in some demand for this 20-year issue, but not as much demand as the market had hoped, and really a pretty sharp cross-asset reaction to that. Not only yields spiking across the Treasury curve, equity markets extending losses, paring some of them back, but we're still looking at about a 1% drop in the S&P 500. As far as Bitcoin, it had reached that record earlier in the day, still marginally positive for the day, but back about $1,000 or $2,000 below that record. So at least from a knee-jerk perspective, the markets are not taking this auction today very positively.
Mike Regan, I'm confused because we saw all of this coming, didn't we? President Trump ran on extending the Trump tax cuts. There were estimates that it would add trillions to the deficit going back months ago, long before the election. He also ran on tariffs. He said it was his favorite word, the best word in the dictionary. Both of them hit after the election. We ran up in stocks, and now somehow we're disappointed that it's actually happening, or surprised. Shouldn't the market have been pricing all this in?
Yeah, Joe, I think the market sort of discounts what Trump is promising and what they believe will actually happen. What will be politically feasible for him to accomplish. And certainly, we've heard from a lot of investors who did not believe the tariff, the trade tensions would be as sort of acute as they've proven to be. And there's always a question of, well, Trump wants to do this. What does Congress, what are they willing to give him? Regardless of the fate of this bill, the big, beautiful bill being negotiated in Congress, it's becoming pretty clear that we're not going to be looking at a sharply reduced federal deficit, regardless of what Congress agrees on. At least that's the thinking in the market right now. And I think, just those bigger deficits mean more debt at these higher interest rates. It's just a lot for the market to swallow right now.
Great conversation, as always, with Mike Regan. Thank you for jumping on with us, Mike, with a real turn in the markets here following this 20-year bond auction. We'll keep tabs on this for you, of course, throughout the day here on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. And on any other day, what took place today in the Oval Office would be our lead story. It's one of many at the moment, as the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, arrives at the White House amid allegations of genocide put forth by President Trump against white Afrikaners, in many cases white farmers, some of whom have been given refugee status here in the United States. It started off as a cordial conversation. The president then started to dig into these allegations, going so far as to even show a video with unsubstantiated claims of this persecution. The South African president was given a chance to speak. Here's what he said.
It will take President Trump listening to the voices of South Africans, some of whom are his good friends, like those who are here. When we have talks between us on the quiet table, it will take President Trump to listen to them.
President Ramaphosa at the White House for lunch and a bilateral meeting with President Trump that presumably includes other issues, including trade. And we want to talk about this with Patrick Gaspard. A perfect day to have the distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, his former U.S. ambassador to South Africa in the Obama administration. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Donald Trump is talking about genocide today. What should be the response from South Africa?
Well, thank you so very much for having me on. But it's a bizarre day to be on here today. Donald Trump is talking about genocide in South Africa. Let's be really clear here. There is absolutely positively no credible human rights organization in South Africa or anywhere in the world that says that there's a genocide taking place in South Africa. So the response from President Ramaphosa has to only be, one, there's no genocide. Two, the bilateral partnership between the U.S. and South Africa is incredibly important for both sides of the Atlantic, on security, on the economy, on trade. And we've got to do things to bridge this gap, both in the facts and in the material relationship between the two countries.
Well, President Trump brought to the Oval Office the facts that he wanted to underscore, at least what was presented as fact, a video with monitors that had been rolled in and edited together for those in the Oval Office to see in person, printed handouts of stories in which he said they described horrible death of white South Africans, knowing that it did seem that a certain amount of this was staged, and knowing as well, Mr. Ambassador, that Cyril Ramaphosa, while not in the presidential role, was in the South African government at the time you were serving as ambassador, so you do know the players here. How did he conduct himself? Did he do well?
Well, I've known President Ramaphosa ever since he was a labor leader in the country when I first visited in 1991. President Ramaphosa did everything that he could to maintain his composure and not only his personal dignity, but the dignity of the nation that he represents. But it's really hard when you're sitting across from Donald Trump and he's laying out not facts, Kailey, but propaganda. The film that he showed comes from an organization called AfroForum, that's known to be aligned with the most extreme fringe right-wing elements, not only in South Africa, but in the U.S., Australia, and other places. They are adjacent to people who have been identified as neo-Nazis. So these are questionable characters. You should also understand that the Black South African who's in the video exhorting violence against white Afrikaners is another fringe character who is not in the government, who Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC soundly defeated in the last elections, and who has no credible power in the country. So it's rhetoric, no fact, all propaganda. White Afrikaners, who make up less than 8% of the population, represent less than 2% of the murder victims in South Africa. Furthermore, that small Afrikaner population also happen to be some of the largest landowners in a country that has real asymmetries of economic inclusion. Those are the things that South Africans are trying to solve for with the partnership of the U.S. through trade, through hundreds of thousands of jobs that are reliant on the African Growth and Opportunity Act that I helped to renegotiate, that's up for renegotiation now, and that Donald Trump and the American people should be settling in a fashion that helps people along the supply chain in America, consumers in America, and workers in South Africa.
This is really helpful context, Ambassador. I'm sure you saw that Elon Musk was in the Oval Office. We didn't hear him speak. But when you step back and consider what just happened, was this an ambush?
It was absolutely an ambush, as evident by the video that you just made reference to being wheeled in. And then the President of the United States sitting there with printed out copies of alleged articles that lay out the crimes against Afrikaners in the country. A president who, by the way, has overturned the entire asylum system in the U.S. for every other nation, every other nationality, but is throwing open the doors to Afrikaners who are allegedly under assault. Elon Musk didn't have to speak. He is the silent partner in the negotiations here. Elon Musk and Starlink have been trying to get into the South Africa space. They're making all kinds of demands on the South African government. And I truly believe that Donald Trump is carrying water for Elon Musk in these conversations. And they're hoping that the South Africans will overturn a regulatory framework that has not made it possible for Musk to operate in South Africa in the way that he would like to. I hate to say this about an American president, but too often we see that there's some kind of a grift that's involved with pronouncements around national security and foreign policy. It's the case here too, I believe.
Well, there's another foreign policy issue, though, that the U.S. seems to take particular exception with when it comes to South Africa, and that's South Africa leading the charge in the International Court of Justice against Israel, claiming that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. That was among the reasons that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in testimony yesterday on Capitol Hill, suggested President Trump won't be attending the G20 summit in November in South Africa, though he didn't necessarily give us a firm answer on that in the Oval Office. Is that policy around Israel reconcilable between these two countries, Mr. Ambassador?
I so appreciate that question from you, and I really wish that dominated the dialogue today in the Oval Office, that and trade, instead of this ridiculous ruse around white genocide. Let's be really clear. South Africa has had a long-standing relationship with elements of the Palestinian leadership, Palestinian civil society. No surprise to anyone that following October 7th, after South Africa appropriately denounced Hamas, appropriately talked about South Africa's right to exist and to defend itself, that it then in turn took up a defense of Palestinians when they saw collective punishment being taken upon tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So that should not have surprised anyone if you know about South Africa's history and record as it relates to Palestinians and global human rights. So now Marco Rubio and Donald Trump, two actors who have not spoken out about the collective punishment in Gaza. Donald Trump, a president of the United States, who said that we should clear all the Palestinians out of Gaza and turn it into some kind of like beachfront property. No concern for that. He's now suddenly talking about genocide, but not in a context anywhere else in the world. He defends Putin's incursion against innocent Ukrainians. He says nothing to speak up about what's happening to Palestinians every single day, where Netanyahu is redoubling down on his occupation and bombing in Gaza. And now he's singling out white Afrikaners who have been ginned up for him by fringe elements of his movement as victims of genocide. The hypocrisy is overwhelming here.
So this is a president of the United States, in your view, whose view has been corrupted by Elon Musk.
I never thought I would live to see the day where a president of the United States would be siding with Vladimir Putin against an innocent sovereign nation that has been invaded and surfacing myth about genocide in one country in order to help the business interests of one of his principal supporters who spent in excess of $250 million on his election. It's an extraordinary thing. We have something in the United States called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and I think that a responsible Congress would be looking thoroughly at these circumstances.
Ambassador, we just have a minute left here, but given everything we've just discussed and the evident tension between the U.S. and South Africa, do you have hope a trade agreement between the two can be reached, knowing at the end of the 90-day period, a 30% reciprocal tariff could be put into place once again?
I'm ever hopeful. The U.S. and South Africa have had challenges in the relationship before. I remember being a young activist, protesting against the resistance of the Reagan administration to lay sanctions against South Africa. We overcame that. There is bipartisan support for the partnership between the U.S. and South Africa on trade, and on health care relief as well. So I think that there are responsible Republicans in the Senate and the House who understand the importance of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, both for security and for economic growth, and they'll increase the pressure to get to some resolution of these charges and of these challenges.
All right, Ambassador, we really appreciate you joining us here on Balance of Power. Former ambassador to South Africa during the Obama administration, Patrick Gaspard, now distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. We appreciate it, and of course, we'll be back for more at 5 p.m. Eastern Time here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
A lot more to follow and a lot more to learn with an apparent meeting between President Trump and the Freedom Caucus on reconciliation. We should know a lot more by the time we meet again right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.